We're presenting a few important early results from analyses of a national survey, which provides the first large-scale picture of US-based high school mathematics teachers, racialized beliefs, and teaching practices. The first phase of our study is a literature review, which provides a definition of racialized learning environments, detailing their characteristics and how minoritized learners experience them, as well as understandings of teachers' inclusive teaching practices, which you can find on the CERN repository. Pardon me, the second phase of our study is a first large-scale picture of how racialized beliefs and practices of teachers influence the learning environment, and that was all informed by phase one. Next slide. So the first phase is a literature review, which provides a definition of racialized learning environments, which you see here on the slide. Really, we're thinking about the ways in which classrooms are organized, the way schools are organized, and the racialized messaging that students encounter about who belongs or not, what kind of work or learning will take place in the classroom environment, and then how it's designed or organized to support or either constrain student identity development and other learning outcomes, as well as how learners are positioned, whether their position is competent or not. And so we know from the research literature that minoritized learners, that is Black, Latinx, and Indigenous youth, experience these classrooms differently. Oftentimes where they may be the only one or one of a few students in that particular classroom, depending on the kind of school environment. They're often made to feel they do not belong, and again, are not positioned as competent. And this is not, these are broad strokes, but just to give you a sense of what we found to be true in the literature. And I'm going to focus on what our literature review revealed about racialized learning environments. They're characterized by pervasive racialized deficit narratives, which is viewing minoritized learners and their families as deficient or in need of repair and less competent than white students. It's also about devaluing learners' lived experiences. And so by that, we simply mean ignoring the effects of systemic racism and unwelcoming classroom environments where learners are made to feel they do not belong. And so I'm going to spend a little bit of time just breaking down what racialized deficit narratives are on the next slide. So it's viewing minoritized learners and their families as deficient or less competent. And what we want to point out here that the literature is really clear about is these are both implicit and explicit. And learners are able to feel them in the learning environment. Next slide. And so some explicit racialized deficit narratives that you may recognize are things like Black and Latinx families are not invested in their children's success in mathematics learning. Or I can't do much for my students because motivation depends on their home environment. Or the amount a student can learn is primarily related to family background. And so these are explicit, but they're using a little bit of coded language around the learner's home environment, their families, and things like that. And so it's saying that these learners are inherently less competent or things like that, right? And so we know that these things are not true, but these are the kinds of explicit racialized deficit narratives that may be circulating in a particular classroom environment. If we move on to thinking about implicit racialized deficit narratives, on the next slide. Thank you. One of them is, for example, which we used in our survey, which we'll talk more about in a moment, is it's not fair to ask students who are struggling to take on challenging mathematics assignments. And so here, a breakdown of understanding this particular narrative is really viewing minoritized learners as deficient instead of finding the supports that those learners might need to engage in challenging tasks. And so it's not giving them the kind of work where they might be challenged, instead giving them kind of assignments that are not rigorous at all. Another example is that we used in our survey is aware of the limits of their ability. I give my students assignments I know they can do so they don't become discouraged. Again, viewing particular students as less competent instead of supporting intellectual struggle, and also thinking that students may become discouraged or not engaged in the classroom if they can't do something. So rather than giving them opportunities to try to learn and to engage in intellectual struggle, teachers may not do that at all. And so a third part of our literature review is really thinking about what inclusive learning environments look like. And so we know that that's critical for learner success. But we have little evidence about the kinds of beliefs that mathematics teachers In particular, especially those in schools with racialized tracking practices, have about inclusive learning environments, how they organize their classrooms, and their related teaching practices. And for those of you that may not be familiar with racialized tracking practices, that's simply the way that classrooms and schools are organized in terms of the school population and how students are placed into different tracks. So for those of us who maybe grew up in the 90s, I might be dating myself, you might have been on the honors track or the advanced placement track or the IB track, right? And so students are tracked very early on, sometimes starting in middle school. What is inequitable about tracking policies? There are many things, but mainly it's that students are placed onto tracks based on measures by their individual, by assessments that may be unfair, but also there's minimal flexibility in course selection and student movement from one track to the other. And so we know that teacher beliefs are really important, but we really ask about them. And so if we move on to the next slide, we've designed the first large-scale teacher survey with race-oriented measures to investigate these particular beliefs. We launched our survey this past summer during COVID, and as you can imagine, that was somewhat difficult to get teachers to complete the survey, but so far we have nearly 300 teachers who've completed the survey, and that our sample is representative of US-based mathematics teachers, racialized, ethnic, and gender identities, as well as representative from all different parts of the country. And so what we found in terms of our preliminary analyses, if we go into the next slide, is that teachers are endorsing some of those implicit and explicit deficit narratives. So you see there in the middle slide, the kinds of ideas that teachers are taking away and how they're explaining disparate outcomes and how they're thinking about their teaching practices. We also want to point out here, with just a little bit of time that we have left, that among high school mathematics teachers in our sample who believe that Black or African-American students who perform below average on tests, over half of those teachers in our sample are attributing that performance to things like a lack of effort, interest, and cultural values as moderately to extremely important in explaining the differences in terms of achievement. And so those are deficit narratives. And so if teachers are endorsing those kinds of ideas, that's not good. And so students would not feel a sense of belonging in the classroom. If we move on to the next slide. Thinking about inclusive teaching practices, we were also interested in thinking about the kinds of practices that teachers employ in mathematics classrooms. Over half of the teachers in our sample reported using inclusive teaching practices at least once a month or more, some reporting using them as often as every day, others only once a week. And some examples of that are using examples that are relatable for students from different cultural backgrounds, studying the curriculum to determine whether it reinforces negative cultural stereotypes, or this idea, again, of trying to incorporate students' lived experiences into the mathematics classroom. And so we asked teachers to provide an example of what that might look like, and about nearly 70% of the teachers who said that they use some sort of inclusive teaching practice at least once a month provided us with an open-ended example. And so teachers shared things like in the geometry classroom, presenting ideas, allowing students to present their ideas in relationship to the real world examples and things that are relevant to their cultural backgrounds. And so we have a lot of examples that we'd have you talk about later of what teachers are doing. If we move on to the next slide, what we're noticing that we think is really important that we want to highlight here is that some teachers' responses, so even though they might not have endorsed an explicit deficit narrative, in other cases, when we asked other questions about kind of how they organize their classroom or what their teaching practices day to day look like, many teachers endorsed that a mastery of skills is more important than their learners engaging in complex tasks, or that they really want to, they overemphasize, I think a big part of their teaching is correcting students' mistakes rather than allowing children to engage in productive struggle and learn together from those mistakes. And so this is really important for us to think about in terms of how children are belonging and feeling a sense of belonging in the classroom, but also the kinds of opportunities that they have to learn in the classroom. If we move on to the next slide, what we want to think about is just shifting both mindsets and practices in terms of the ways that teachers are thinking. Once we are aware of those deficit narratives, what are they doing to combat them, and how do we help them to engage in more inclusive practices? That's my time, so I will stop there. Thank you so much.